I saw myself lying in my hospital bed from both above and next to it. I saw that there was only one nurse in the room, sitting in a rocking chair watching over me. I knew it was okay for me to leave the room. I walked down the hall and began to feel a warm sensation. I followed it into a tunnel that grew brighter, and as I walked along I began to smell wonderful flowers. I knew they were carnations. As I reached the end of the tunnel I realized that I was dressed as a woman dressed in 1940. As I reached the end there were clouds that seemed to be parting, and there I saw a pair of hands. At the sight of them, I was overcome with emotion, a deep in my soul feeling of grief, happiness, and love. I knew without looking at the face of the person who he was, my grandfather, who had died in World War II, 20 years before I was born. As I stepped out I was aware that we were in a town and walking down the sidewalk of the main street. Everyone who we passed or talked to knew my grandfather and was really excited to see that I had come to see him. All of the women in town were dressed in their Sunday best. We passed a hat store, a butcher's market, a pharmacy, and the streets were lined with dogwood trees in full bloom. As we walked, we did some talking. He told me he had been waiting a long time to talk to me, that he knew I would be the only one who could correct things. He told me he had watched my dad, his only child, grow, and had grieved with my grandmother, his wife, for all that they missed, but that he was proud of her for raising my dad alone. We talked about when I was born, how my mother kept stating that a man in a uniform had walked into the room, smiled, and left. The doctors told her it was from the medication. She had never told me this, but when I asked her, she turned real pale. Anyway, we decided to have fried chicken for supper, and after we went to his house, which I knew very well, my grandmother had kept it until the 1980s, I slept in a huge bed with blankets fresh from hanging on the line. It was such a real feeling of being home, safe, and loved. I felt such peace that night. Over the next few days we really talked, and he asked me to tell him what I had been told growing up about him. I felt such sorrow. I had really never been told much, other than he was killed while training in flight school in World War II, that was it. It was a subject that was not brought up, and I honestly had no interest in it. My grandfather took my hands and asked me to do something for him. He asked me to look into his crash because the army had not given the families the correct findings, and that they all, his crew, needed their families to know. I asked him how to do this, and he just looked really deep into my soul and said I would know how. He also asked that I take our family history and continue it, that it would be a wonderful journey. My grandfather told me that it was time for me to go back. I felt all of these strong emotions. The biggest two were a deep sense of sorrow and grief and a real connection of love, a deep feeling of having a knowledge of him that only he and I share. I tried to lock in my memory everything I could about him, the way he looked, talked, smiled, and how wonderful he smelled. We held each other for a long time and I cried as I had never done before. I just knew I did not want to leave him. As we walked down the street towards the white light and clouds, I asked him if I would see him again. He told me he would always be with me, as the warm light. I entered the tunnel, walked back to my room, and found the same nurse still rocking in her chair. I know she smiled at me.